As you know, most of my lessons are just one-word titles. This one is maybe a little awkward, like seen. What do you mean by seen? Well, what I mean by seen is the verse that I'm using as the text of the message this morning. It's taken from the Old Testament book of Job, chapter 42, verse 5. I had heard about you before, Job says, but now I have seen you. Because for Job, it all happened in an instant, in a moment, in a flash for him. One day he could choose his tea time at the nicest golf course, let's say, on the planet. The next he couldn't even be a caddy on any one of those golf courses. One day he could zip across the country in his Learjet just to see a heavyweight bout maybe at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. The next he couldn't afford a bus across town. You talk about your calm becoming chaos. That is how we are introduced to Job. Because the first thing that goes is his empire. The market crashes, his assets tumble. What's liquid has now gone dry. What's been up goes down, his stocks go flat, and Job goes broke. And there he sits in this fancy leather chair and soon to be auctioned off mahogany desk when the phone rings to tell him about the next calamity. The kids were at a nearby resort for the holiday. A storm came in, blew down the holiday where they were staying, the location, and blew the kids away as well. At this point in time, you get the impression that Job is somewhat shell-shocked and speechless. Job stares out the window maybe and into the sky that seems to be getting darker for him by each second that passes. And he starts praying, telling God that things simply can't get any worse than they already are. And that's exactly what happens for Job. Because all of a sudden now he feels this pain in his chest, and he knows that it's more than just last night's chili. And the next thing he knows, he's bouncing the back of an ambulance with wires stuck to his chest and needles stuck in his arm. He ends up hooked up to a heart monitor in a community hospital room. Next to him is a total stranger who can't speak a word of English. Not that Job is really looking for conversation at this point in time in his life. Because the first thing that happens is his wife comes into the hospital room. And who could blame her for being really super upset about the day's calamities? Her family, as she has known it, has been decimated. Her children have been killed. Her finances have been ruined. Her husband is now in the hospital. So who could blame her for telling Job to, just curse God? But to stand in a hospital room and tell your husband to curse God and die? If Job had not felt completely abandoned before, he does the very minute that his wife tells him to pull the plug and just get it over with. And then there are Job's friends. And they have pretty much the bedside manner of a platoon of sergeants and the compassion level of, maybe a serial killer. A slightly revised version of their theology might sound a little bit like this. Wow, Job, you must have done something really, 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 really bad. Because we know that God is good. So if bad things are happening to you, then you must have done something pretty bad. That's his friend's theology. Here's Job's response. You are doctors who don't know what they're doing. Oh, please just be quiet. That would be your highest wisdom. And if you need a translation for that, it's like, why don't you just shut up and take your stupid philosophy back to the dump where you learned it? Because Job starts arguing with them, saying, I'm not this bad person that you think I am, or that you're even suggesting that I am, or that you're even saying that I am. I'm not a bad guy. I've paid my taxes. I'm active in the community. I'm a major contributor to the United Way. And I volunteer at my kids' school. Job is, in Job's eyes, a good man. And a good man, he reasons, deserves a good answer. So Elihu, one of the more vocal of these friends, says, your suffering is for your own good, Job. And this is like Elihu's a young preacher just out of seminary, let's say. And he hasn't lived long enough to be cynical, and he hasn't been hurt enough just to be quiet. So you get the impression that Elihu in the hospital room is pacing back and forth, and he's got this Bible under his arm and his finger punching the air. And here's what he says in Job chapter 33, verse 29. God does all these things to a man, twice, even 3 times, to turn back his soul from the pit, that the light of life may shine on him. Job is, on my mind's eye, following his pacing in the room back and forth, a bit like a ping pong match. His head turning from side to side as he listens to Elihu preach to him about why Job is in the position that he's in. What the young man says, this Elihu, isn't particularly bad theology, but it certainly is absolutely no comfort for a person who's hooked up to heart monitors, who's lost his entire estate and all of his children. So Job slowly begins to tune him out and gradually slides a little lower and a little lower and a little lower under the covers. His head hurts, his eyes burn, his legs ache, and he just can't stomach any of this anymore. He is tired of all the hollow homilies that he's heard from all of his supposed friends. Yet his question in his mind still has not been answered, because his question is, God, why is this happening to me? So, God speaks. Out of the thunder, God speaks. Out of the sky, God speaks. For all of us who would put ditto marks under Job's question, why is this happening to me? God bless you. For those of us who have dared to say, if God is really God, and if he really cares about me, or if God is so good, then why would he allow these things to happen to me? That's when God speaks. He did for Job. He speaks out of the storm, and then he speaks into the storm, because that's where Job is. Job is in a storm. As I've tried to describe it for you, he has heart problems that have to be monitored in the hospital. He has lost his entire fortune and all of his children, and what should have been his best friend, his partner in life, his wife, says, why don't you just curse God and die? Job is not in a good place, church. And he's asking these hard questions in the middle of a life that has been brought to an absolute ruin. He speaks out of the storm, and God speaks into the storm. because that's where Job is. And sometimes that's where God, for all of us, including Job, is best heard. God's voice thunders in the room. Elihu sits down, Job sits up, and the two will never, ever be the same again. So starting in Job chapter 38, verse 2, God asks Job this question: who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Job, at this point in time, does not respond. Continuing on, God says, brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me. Tell me if you know so much, God says in Job chapter 38, verse 4. Now, one question would have been just enough for Job, but it wasn't good enough for God. And he continues, do you know how its dimensions were determined? And who did the surveying, God asks? What supports its foundation? And who laid its cornerstone? And as the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Job chapter 38, verses 5 through 7. Questions are rushing now out at Job like sheets of rain. They splash in the chamber of Job's heart with this wildness and this beauty and this terror that leave Job and every other Job out there, every other Job who has lived feeling drenched and speechless, watching the Master redefine who's who in the universe. Continuing on, Job chapter 38, verse 12. Have you ever once commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Have you ever told the daylight to spread to the ends of the earth, to end the night's wickedness? God's questions aren't intended to teach. God's questions are intended to stun Job. They aren't intended to enlighten. They're intended to awaken. They aren't intended to stir Job's mind. They're intended to bend Job's knees. And God continues. Has the location of the gates of death been revealed to you? Do you realize the extent of the earth? Tell me about it if you know. Where does the light come from? And how do you get there? Or tell me about the darkness. Where does it come from? Can you find its boundaries? Can you go to its source? Oh, but of course you know all of this. For you were born before it was all created, and you are so very experienced. I'm not making this up, church. Job chapter 38, verses 17 through 21. That's exactly what God is saying to Job. And after a while, Job finally raises a very feeble hand and lifts it to his mouth. And God stops talking long enough for Job to respond. And he says in Job chapter 40, verses 4 and 5, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I lay my hand upon my mouth in silence. I have said too much already. You see, church, God's message has finally connected in Job's heart. Because Job now understands that he's a mere peasant, telling the king how to run his kingdom. Job is an illiterate, telling E.E. Cummings to capitalize his personal pronouns. If you know anything about E. E. Cummings, there's no capital letters in his name. It's lowercase e period, lowercase e period, and Cummings is spelled lowercase c, U-M-M-I-N-G-S. Job is a bat boy telling Babe Ruth how to adjust his swing. Job is the clay telling the potter not to press so hard. But God is not finished. He continues, I owe no one anything. What God declares in this crescendo of this conversation. Everything under heaven is mine. Job chapter 41, verse 11. And Job can't argue. Because what can Job say? God owes no one anything. God doesn't owe anyone any explanations. He doesn't owe anyone excuses. Doesn't owe anyone any help. God has no debt. He has no outstanding balance. He owes no one any favors that he feels obligated to return. God owes no man anything, which makes the fact that he gave us everything even more unbelievable. And how you interpret this dialogue between God and Job is, in my opinion, absolutely key to understanding our God. Because you can interpret God's hammering and his speech as this divine, in-your-face beatdown. And you can look at it that way if you wish. You can use the list of all the unanswerable questions to prove that God is harsh, that he's cruel, that he's distant. And you can use the book of Job, if you wish, as evidence that God gives us questions with no answers. But be careful, because if you use the book of Job for that reason, you're going to need some scissors. Because to do that requires you to cut out the rest of the book of Job. Because that's how Job wanted to hear it. He didn't hear it as some beatdown. Because he knows all of his life he's been a good man. All of his life he's believed in God. All of his life he's talked about God, had notions about God, prayed to God. But in the storm, Job finally sees God. He sees hope. He sees a God who loves. He sees a God who can destroy. He sees a giver, a taker, a dreamer, a deliverer. It's no longer just talk about it. It's no longer just having some thoughts about God. It's no longer just some sort of intellectual exercise praying to an invisible God. It's finally seeing God. Job, I think, sees the tender anger of a God whose unending love is often received with mistrust. Job stands like a blade of grass against this consuming fire of God's splendor. And Job's demands, why God, melt like wax as God slowly pulls back the curtain and heaven's light falls unsurpassed across the entirety of earth, because Job now finally sees God. And God could have turned away at that point, right? I mean, the gavel has been slammed, right? The verdict's been rendered. God's told Job everything that God wanted to say. The eternal judge, in this case, has spoken. But God isn't angry with Job. Firm? Yeah. Direct? No doubt. Clear and convincing? Yes, absolutely. But angry? No. God's not angry with Job. God is never, ever irritated by the questions of honest seekers. And if you were to underline any passage in the book of Job, I'd underline the word and the verse that forms the basis for this message this morning. I heard about you before, but now I have seen you. Job sees God, and that's enough. But it's not enough for God, because the years to come find Job once again sitting behind that mahogany desk with his health restored and his profits way up. His lap is once again full of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. In fact, we know from Job, for 4 generations, Job has been blessed. And if Job ever wonders why God doesn't bring back the children that he had taken away earlier, he doesn't ask. But maybe he doesn't ask because he knows that his children could never be happier than where they are, in the presence of the one that Job has finally seen, albeit briefly. And something tells me that Job would probably do it all over again if he could. And if that's what it took to hear God's voice and to stand in God's presence. Even if God left him with bed sores and bills, Job would do it again. And I think the reason why is because God gave Job more than Job had ever dreamed. God gave Job himself. And church, he has done the same for us. Alvin quoted the verse this morning. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. And so perhaps, I guess then, as they say, seeing is believing. But perhaps in the case of Job, believing is then seeing. We wonder sometimes in our life why things happen. Why would a good God allow bad things to happen to me or somebody I love? And I have told this church many times, when you put the words why and God in the same sentence, I don't have any answers. But I do know that from time to time I've felt a little like Job, beat up, thinking, I've done the best that I knew how to. God, why am I being put in this situation? Why am I being caused to suffer this way? Job got his answer. His answer came from a loving God who is very firm and very direct. You know, Job, you don't really need to be asking me a lot of these kinds of questions, because where were you when the world was created? Do you make the sun rise? Do you know where the end of darkness is? Do you know who laid out the foundation of the planets? The answer is no. But if God is who he says he is, then don't you think God knows what's best for all of us? And sometimes in the storms of our life is when we see God the clearest, because he can speak to us through our hurt. reduce us to a point where we have nowhere else to go but to God, who then says, child, I love you. I loved you so much I gave my son for you so that you might have eternal life and live with me forever. That, church, is the greatest gift that has been ever given. And the thing is, it's been given. You don't have to earn it. It's been given to you. You merely have to accept it. And that's the puzzling thing about Christianity and the way that the world looks at Christianity. There is no other religion other than Christianity that does not require you to do something, to pay your tithes or to belong to this organization or to go out and do these things, somehow earning your salvation. Christianity is the only religion that gives to its believers gifts that they could not otherwise purchase on their own. And in exchange, ask you to believe, to accept that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, to admit the fact that we all make mistakes and none of us are that good as we might think so, realize that our sin keeps us away from God, understand that Jesus is the way back to God, to then get into Jesus by being baptized and raising to this new walk of life so that we can live like Jesus and throughout the rest of our days be molded into the image that he created us to be. Sometimes the harshness of this world is simply the chisel that's trying to release the image inside that God created us to have. And it hurts and it's painful. But sometimes with some perspective, we look back on it and say, that was really necessary because I wasn't seeing God as clearly as I should. So church, we've all felt probably from time to time like Job, but be encouraged that what sounds like harsh words are just simply God trying to let you know who he is and where we fit, and that he loves us so much that he would give his only son to die for us so that we might be with him forever. That is seeing who God is. Elliot, could you advance? So, on Jordan's stormy banks, we all stand there, don't we? And we cast this wishful eye for this sweet land on the other side, this sweet by and by. This song talks about life's journeys, being on these stormy banks, but having confidence and hope in a God that now we can truly see because he loves us so much that he gave his only son to die for us. So we're going to stand and sing this song. If you have any prayer requests, now would be the time to bring them up. We'll pray about them and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand.